Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm back bringing you another look at comic concepts. Now, timing overall is a very difficult concept to talk about in comics because they are static images on a page. The artist only has so much control over ways to control how a person is reading it, the speed and tempo at which that takes place. Now, that's often true in other mediums as well. After all, when you're listening to music or watching a movie, at least if you're doing it at home in an environment you control as you would read a book, you have a certain amount of control over the playback speed of that media. But with books and comics in particular, there's not a lot of room to control how fast or how slow a person goes through the story. As such, most ways you can control timing in a comic are aspects of other techniques. As I discussed when I talked about leading the eye, and I mentioned in there, you can use a large swooping motion to kind of lead an eye around a panel or the entire page, making that panel take up a little more time than if a person just runs their eyes over it from top to bottom. It's the difference between a straight line and a circle. Of course, if you're really curious about that, I talk about it more in depth in that video, and I'm not going to rehash it here. I'm specifically interested in one of the handful of techniques that does actually have something to do with the rate and timing at which a person experiences your story, and that is a page turn. Now, regardless of whether your audience is going to read your comic physically or whether they are going to read it online, the page turn is still an important concept to keep in mind. Page turns are going to take place either way. That said, if you plan to work in a digital format, I would recommend not thinking of every page as a page turn, for reasons that I'm going to discuss in a moment. You may want to turn that digital format into a physical format at some point, and then of course you are going to have to deal with the formatting constraints of a physical medium. And unless you intend to print your comic with only one page showing at any time, you will want to think about the physical layout issues involved in this. So a page turn is just what it sounds like. Whenever a person reaches the bottom right hand, or in manga, the bottom left hand, of the two pages that are open and facing them as they are reading your book, they are going to have to stop and turn the page before they can continue reading your story. This creates a certain amount of hidden information. When a person is going through your story panel by panel, they can see what is coming up. No matter what you do, no matter what artistic tricks you use, that entire page is going to be right there in front of them. Or the entire 2 pages if they are reading a physical book, which is, from this point forward, how I intend to discuss the use of this technique. So you can't hide information on those open pages, but you can hide the information that is going to come after they turn the page. Unless a person is scrolling through your comic in PDF format, they are not going to be able to see the beginning of the next page and the end of the current page. And PDFs, not exactly the best way to read comics. I personally think there is some merit to it, but there are also ways to create the traditional page-turning reading experience. So I would not keep those too much in the forefront of my mind as I am laying out a comic. Even in a PDF, you can get the traditional reading experience, and it's at that point, I think, on the reader to work out how to get that experience rather than worrying about what may or may not be given away by the way you format your comic. Anyway, point is, the page turn creates this suspense or this build-up to the moment they turn the page and they see what is going to happen next. This is a very powerful narrative moment. Anticipation and tension are very valuable things to have in storytelling, and they get your audience really invested in what is going to happen. With proper attention paid to pacing and pagination, you can really exploit that tension and anticipation at your page turn to create very memorable and dramatic moments. Not every page turn has to be a big moment in your story. In fact, it's probably best to just have 1 or 2 in the typical chapter. But if you know you have a moment of great import where suspense or anticipation are going to pay big dividends, paying attention to your pagination and lining up those moments at a page turn will make them hit much harder. This is also a very versatile technique, so for today's examples, I've actually chosen two. The first example is a dramatic use of the page turn. It comes from chapter 26 of the series Akane Banashi. To briefly recap for context, the protagonist, Akane, is seeking to become a professional rakugo performer, rakugo being a type of performing art in Japan. A rakugo performer, or rakugoka, is not the most popular form of entertainment in modern Japan, but it has a certain amount of cultural cachet, being very traditional. Now, Akane is following in the footsteps of her father, who aimed to be a rakugoka himself. However, he was expelled by the leader of his school some 6 years ago. The man who expelled Akane's father goes by the stage name Isho Arakawa, and he is the judge at a competition for amateurs who are interested in rakugo. By this point in time, Akane has spent most of the last 6 years studying under the master who taught her father the art form. Her goal is to become a professional and show Isho Arakawa the folly of expelling her father. However, in order to best do that, it would help if she knew why her father was expelled in the first place, because Isho Arakawa has never had to explain himself. So, Akane goes to this competition, one she is eminently overqualified for, and she smokes everyone, which is really not very good form. This is supposed to be to get people who otherwise don't have a lot of interest in the art form into performing it. Having someone who has already spent years of their life training to master the art form is really not in the spirit of the event. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. You see, Akane's mentor goes by the stage name Shiguma Arakawa. Shiguma and Isho studied together under the same master of the Arakawa school. And since the expulsion incident, where Isho expelled not only Akane's father, but all the other students who were studying at the time, Isho and Shiguma have not spoken directly to one another. That said, they were students together, and Isho can recognize Shiguma's work, even if the work is not a performance, but one of his pupils. As Akane has been on stage performing her rakugo, Isho has been watching her and seeing Shiguma. So, as Akane wraps up her performance, the organizers turn to Isho, the highest profile judge present, and they ask him for his opinion. At which point, we get this page. The sharp-eyed will recognize the 4-act formula typical of Japanese storytelling here. We have an introduction in the first panel, where we see Isho Arakawa from the back, gathering his thoughts as he prepares to speak. Then we get the development as we see Akane waiting to hear her fate pronounced. The twist here is very interesting, because it shows us Isho opening his mouth before he actually speaks, which suggests he is censoring what he actually wants to say. Or perhaps he's debating whether he wants to speak with his true thoughts rather than the highly edited, sanitized, and frankly very gentle feedback he has given the other competitors in this event, who are, after all, just amateurs. Finally, in the resolution, he begins to speak. He says, "You." And then we get the page turn. We have a moment to ask ourselves, what is this famously harsh, severe critic going to say after watching Akane perform with the style and voice of Isho's fellow pupil? Then we turn the page, and we see this face brimming with an incredible hostility as he says, "You don't belong here." And Akane acknowledges that, because she has done something of an underhanded thing just so she can confront this man and see what's in his head. This is an incredibly powerful moment, and it is the beginning of a gripping 50-page long confrontation between these two characters that defines our protagonist, our antagonist, and the world in which they live in incredibly stark terms. Honestly, up until chapter 26, I had been enjoying reading Akane Banashi, but I hadn't really thought anything special about it. After I finished chapter 28, I was certain this was going to be a classic. And it has not failed to disappoint, but one of the most memorable things about these chapters is the way they use the page turn to constantly build tension as these two dig into the philosophy of Isho Arakawa and what it means for Rakugo, or really any performing art in the modern era. It's fascinating, and it's brilliantly written and illustrated. If you get the chance to read it, I highly recommend checking it out. But you don't just have to use the page turn to effectuate high drama. You can also use it to effectuate comedy, which is kind of ironic because Rakugo is technically a form of comedic art, which was doubtless the first thing you thought when you saw the face of Isho Arakawa staring up at you after that page turn, right? This guy, clearly a laugh riot. So, our second example is an example of using the page turn for comedy. It comes from the Space Savers issue of the comic Dr. McNinja. Now, unfortunately, Dr. McNinja is no longer available to read as a free webcomic, which I had originally thought it was as I was putting this episode together, but as I began to record it and collect my reference material, it turns out that it's no longer available for free on the web. However, there are a number of free library services where you can borrow it from in a digital format, which is the way it was originally written, or you can get the comics off of Amazon. So if you get a chance to check it out, I highly recommend it. The comedy in this book is really, really good. But for today, we're just going to take a look at one gag. Now, if you're not familiar with Dr. McNinja as a whole, it is a story about a medical doctor who is also a ninja. And in this particular issue, he is helping a time traveler who has come back from the future to prevent the invasion of Earth by dinosaurs from outer space. In order to do this, they are in the process of stealing an air-to-air missile and sneaking it into Cape Canaveral so they can hijack the space shuttle and use it to shoot down an incoming scout ship that will reveal the presence of Earth to the dinosaurs. That all makes more sense in context if you go back and you actually read the story. We don't have the time to really explain any of those elements here. What you really need to know is Doc needs a missile, and his family is stealing it for him. Because, of course, the McNinjas are a ninja clan. And the Doc is not the only superhuman martial arts assassin that he knows. It's a pre-established part of the lore that Doc's little brother wants to be an engineer, scientist, roboticist, etc., when he grows up, and he builds all these robot animals to do chores for him, and occasionally help out with Doc's misadventures. So after retrieving the missile, Sean McNinja packs up the missile in a alligator robot and sends it to Doc. On this page, we see the Doc fighting that robot because you always have to fight the robots for some reason, and he opens it up to find a missile inside. Okay, so far so good. But then, this sheriff deputy shows up and he's like, what's going on here? You're not supposed to be just killing and eating the alligators. This is Florida after all, but there's still rules. Or at least that's probably the speech he's going to give until he realizes there's a live warhead in this alligator. And if you've read Dr. McNinja, this is the kind of hijinks that you are used to. This is the bread and butter of the series. So it raises the question, how is Doc going to get out of this situation? Well, after this, we have a page turn. And we have to turn the page to figure out what the solution is going to be. Oh. Ooh. He is a ninja. Yes. We never really find out what happens in that top third of this page. It is, in my opinion, a brilliant gag that relies on the page turn as part of the setup. A situation is given to us, we wonder how is he going to get out of it, and then we are intentionally left with no clear indication of what happened. Comedy is a hard thing to pull off in a static medium like comics or even prose, because timing is a big part of comedy. Sure, you can have clever wordplay, or you can have absurdism, and in case you haven't guessed it yet, a big part of Dr. McNinja is in fact absurdism. But ultimately, if you want a really hard-hitting joke, one that really jumps off the page and hits you, you have to be able to set it up with a certain amount of cadence, with a certain amount of timing to it. And the brilliance of Christopher Hastings in this particular moment is that he exploits the nature of a page turn, even a page turn on the internet, because you still had to click a button to move forward from the first page to the second. He uses that timing to set up his joke and make sure it lands with the appropriate timing. That is the power of the page turn in comics. Don't underestimate it. You don't have to use it all the time. This is not something like leading the eye or making sure every panel contains a story. This is the spice that makes the most important moments in your story really pop. And that's our thought for today. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.